Thank you, Felix. He is correct. I do, in fact, have another book theoretically on the way. It's more theory than on the way right now. We'll get to that. It's coming. It will be called Material Spirituality, a Transcendental Phenomenology of Religion. So it is the long promised, long threatened book actually in the philosophy of religion that hasn't happened yet, but is coming and is happening soon. So I'm teaching the book manuscript next semester. So now it has to be like, this is how I made myself do it, right? I have to do it now. There's people expecting it. So it will come soon. Look for it. Thank you again to Olga, to Jeff, and to the center here for organizing this conference. I'm really looking forward to it. I apologize. I'm Canadian, so I have to apologize for something. I apologize for not having a PowerPoint, but it made Sam's day that I didn't. So I'm, some people are happy and some people are not. I will just jump into the paper. It should take 30 minutes or so we should have lots of time for questions afterwards. And like Martin said, I leaned heavily into the sort of exploratory workshop portion of this. So I'm going to be trying some new things and some new ideas. And then we can see if they work or if they don't, right? There's some parts are well developed and other parts less so. So here we go. My paper is called How We Experience That Which Is Not the Content of an Experience. Okay, so I think it's going to build actually quite nicely on Martin's paper that we just gave. It's using some slightly different terminology, but I think we're getting at functionally very much the same thing. So phenomenology has long been interested in our experience of non-objects. Indeed, I think we could say that phenomenology exists as a distinct philosophical approach precisely because of its interest in non-objects. And by non-objects, I mean that which is not an object in the grammatical sense of any particular experience, that which does not receive the action of the verb, right? So that which is not experienced directly. More specifically then, by non-objects, I mean those things which are not, properly speaking, the content of our experience, that which is not the thing or the matter that is experienced, right? So how then can we speak, as I promised to do in the title, of how we experience that which is not the content of an experience? If it is not experienced, how can we talk about how we experience it, right? That doesn't seem to work. It seems impossible, but it is not, I'm claiming, in part because of the distinction within experience that Husserl opens up between that which we experience and our experiencing of it. This seems, in calling our experience of things the transcendental conditions, which is what Husserl does, Husserl, in doing that, Husserl takes over the Kantian transcendental project, but with a crucial twist. For Husserl, the transcendental is not a priori, which is to say it is not apart from experience, rather it arises within experience. And in that sense, phenomenological transcendentals, unlike Kantian or neo-Kantian ones, phenomenological transcendentals are not logical preconditions. They are the actual experiencing of the things or matters experienced. They are how we experience them. And this experiencing is a crucial element of our experience of the world. So what I'm going to try to do with the paper is I'm going to talk about a few people, but I'm not going to cite text. I want us to actually do some phenomenologizing and some thinking through. So there'll be some experience, some thought experiments or examples along the way. So experience cannot be wholly reduced to that which we experience. Okay? This is the mistake that naive empiricism makes, according to Husserl. Right? As if my experience, and here, my examples, I'm going to continue the long and illustrious history of philosophers having no imagination. So all of my experiences are drawn from like the things in my immediate, like when I look up from my typing, I can see that. Let's use that as an example. That's where all of my examples come from. Right? So experience cannot be reduced wholly to that which we experience, right? This is the problem with naive empiricism. As if my experience of sitting in my office watching the fire burn in the fireplace is simply a person sitting in an office while a fire burns in the fireplace, right? While that person sitting in the office while a fire burns in the fireplace is a necessary part of what would give truth value to the proposition I am sitting in my office watching the fire burn in the fireplace, right? So it's necessary, but my experience cannot be reduced to that proposition. Experiencing is not just what is experienced, right? Experiencing itself is part of the experience that we have to account for, right? Experiencing makes a difference. On the other hand, experiencing cannot be reduced simply to the actions or the self-awareness of the monadic subject either, as if experiencing is just the will of the subject made manifest simultaneously in the world and in the subject's own awareness. This is the mistake that what we could call naive idealism makes, according to Husserl. So, my experience of sitting in my office and watching the fire burn in the fireplace is, this is the takeaway, is not something that takes place in my mind. It takes place in my office, right? Which is in the world. Experiencing is not just mental awareness of contexts, of contents. It is an act that takes place in the world. So with these two guardrails in place, avoiding naive empiricism on the one hand, acknowledging experiencing makes a difference, and avoiding naive idealism on the other, acknowledging experiencing is an act in the world and not just in my mind. With those two guardrails in place, I want to try in our brief time together to help us better understand experiencing as it has been explained in the phenomenological tradition. My hope will be to avoid, for the most part, textual analysis and instead focus our attention on experiencing itself. To do that, I will be drawing liberally on insights from throughout the phenomenological tradition. The point will not be to argue for this or for that as a proper reading of Husserl or Merleau-Ponty or Michel-Henry, but rather to explain the matters themselves. What is experiencing and how do we experience it? To answer these questions, I will begin by highlighting three distinct elements at work in experiencing. I will then try to account for how we experience each of those distinct elements in turn. How do we experience our embeddedness, in particular Stiftungen? This is a concept that arises in Husserl. Merleau-Ponty does a lot with it, usually translated as institution. I have reasons why I don't like that translation, so I'll sometimes talk about it as traditions. Lots of times I'll just leave it as Stiftungen because it's easier than trying to translate it. So that's one section. How then do we experience distinct modes of Empfindnisse? Distinct sensings is usually how we translate that into English. And how do we experience that which gives rise to distinct modes of generating Empfindnisse? Right? So these will be the three parts of three modes. But don't worry, I'll explain each of those, why I have those as my three categories in a moment here. So starting with section 1, three elements at work in experiencing. Phenomenology, as a distinct philosophical approach, begins, as I said earlier, with the distinction between what we experience and our experiencing of it. This distinction is not a distinction in content. Our experiencing is not about something other than our experience, right? To go back to my earlier example, my experience of sitting in my office, watching a fire burn in the fireplace, has no other content than me sitting in my office, watching the fire burn in the fireplace, right? That is the content of that experience. There's no other content. There's no secret, back to Martin, there's no something hidden behind that or something like that. There's none of that, right? That's what's going on. So it's not a distinction in content. Rather, this distinction is a distinction in how we pay attention to the expressive core of experience. In any experience, there are some things that we live through so that we can live in other elements. Right? So in hearing me speak, you live through the perceptual quality of the noises that I'm making, and you live in the sense or the meaning that they carry. And you just are living in what I'm saying and understanding those meanings or those contents. We can change which element we pay attention to, right? You could choose to focus on the sounds that I'm making and simply live through the meaning they contain. So we can change which part we pay attention to, but we never, but we only pay attention to one, right? We live through one to live in the other. But when I say we live through one, one of the things I want to highlight, we don't ignore them. Right? You're not ignoring the sounds that I'm making. They remain present, even if in some way in the background, right? You're not, if you were ignoring the sounds I'm making, if you couldn't hear me, you wouldn't know what I was saying. right? So you're not ignoring the perceptual quality, you're just sort of moving through it in a way, right? Like you're moving past it to live in some other part of the experience. And that is, broadly speaking, how experience in general works. This was the last book, The Political Logic of Experience book. That's the whole book. The whole book is just making that case. So if you don't believe me, go read the book and then come back and talk. No, I'm just kidding. You can just ask me in the questions and I'll talk about it. So for the most part, phenomenology, at least in its philosophical guises, has tended to focus on elucidating the different elements at work in our experiencing, right? Different transcendental elements. And it has done so by making those elements the focus of our attention one by one, by a sort of a kind of distinct phenomenological reduction, right? Every reduction sort of takes, here's our experience, we're gonna bracket how we normally live in it, and we're gonna go back to one element. We're gonna focus on this element, or we're gonna focus on this element, or we're gonna focus on this element, right? That's sort of generally how it's done. And indeed, as a method, phenomenology simply is this bracketing of our normal, our naive ways of experiencing things, so we can shift our attention to live in one of the elements that we normally live through. But in doing so, it makes the previously lived through element the focus of or the content of our experience. This helps brings that previously neglected element to our attention, but it also alters that element's normal way of being part of our experience, right? By paying attention to it, by making the content of our experience, it is no longer what it normally is, which is the thing we live through in order to live in something else. And as such, it helps us realize what has always been present in our experience, but it leaves relatively unclear how it is present in our normal experience. Right? By making it the object, we make it something it's not normally, and so we don't pay attention to how it normally shows up. That's what I want to try to bring to light today. How do these things that we normally live through, how do they actually show up in our experience, right? So that we're not just making speculations, we're actually still doing phenomenology. We're still talking about how we experience these things. They do show up, but how do they do that? That's what I want us to think about today. But before we do that, I'm doing a lot of preliminary remarks. I'm on page 4 already. And I keep saying, like, here's what we're gonna do, but not yet. Here's what we're gonna do, but not yet, right? So before we do that, a few more brief introductory remarks. Right, before we do that, we have to acknowledge some of the various elements at work in our experience. Right? There's a couple, and we're going to acknowledge a few of those. In phenomenology, these are known as various transcendental elements of our experience. Right? So what Husserl calls the transcendental, I'm just talking about as experiencing or how we experience things. Over time, the phenomenological tradition has distinguished at least 3 distinct levels of transcendentality at work in our experience. I'm going to summarize these 3 distinct levels as moving sort of from the ground up, so to speak. The quasi-transcendental, or sometimes the empirical transcendental level, the transcendental level, and then the ultra-transcendental level. And those are the 3 levels. To explain them, I'm going to start in the middle, the transcendental, and then we'll go down and we'll go up. So let's start with the transcendental. The transcendental, I'm claiming, refers to our modes of sensing. Husserl's term here is Empfindnisse, which for him is a portmanteau, a combination of Empfindung or sensation, and then Erlebnisse or lived experience. You take a little bit of those and you smash them together, and what you get, these Empfindnisse, are simultaneously then a contact with the world and a subjective living through of that content, right? Like, we're engaging with the world, but we live through that engagement as well. And that living through has a certain focus to it, or has a certain feeling to it, such that we sense the world in a way that is not simply a taking in, but is already a feeling or a sensing, right? We live these sensings. And the plural form is crucial here, for there is not one primary mode of sensing. And initially, maybe we thought there was, right? Some of the early Husserl seems to make reflection into this is our primary mode of sensing is consciousness, is focused attention. But later he's like, nah, I got over that. Right, so there's not a primary mode of sensing. There is always this multiplicity of sensings. This multiplicity then is itself twofold. There's a multiplicity of distinct sensings of a particular type. For example, I see different things, I touch different things, right, through time and simultaneously, right? So there's a multiplicity of touchings. but there's also a multiplicity of types of sensings, right? I engage the world in different fundamental ways. So these different types we speak, especially Merleau-Ponty in his later work talks about these different modes of sensings. We speak of visibility, of tactility, of orality, right, of hearing, and so on as distinct types of sensings. And these distinct types of sensings are in principle irreducible. No amount of seeings leads me to hear something, right? No amount of touching gets me to taste, right? But we also speak typologically. So those are some of the motive sensings of, especially Merleau, like everyone gets the first five, right? Yeah, okay, sensings. But Merleau-Ponty especially highlights these later ones. We also can speak of linguisticality as a way of sensing the world, of sociality as a way of sensing the world, and so on. Perhaps even reflection. This one's a little bit more complicated, but as different ways of sensing the world. And so these things, linguisticality, sociality, maybe even reflection, these name then not just particular human practices, they are also that, right? We have acts of seeing, but more fundamentally, distinct modes of being in contact with the world, each of which opens the world for us in new ways and new dimensions that cannot, properly speaking, be accounted for by other senses. So just as no amount of listening can give us the feeling of hardness or smoothness, so no amount of languaging can give us the feeling of right or wrong, or of social intercourse. And again, that's another problem that we've made historically. Martin pointed to this, the way we have made language into all these other things, or reduced all these other things as if they're just modes of languaging. And fundamentally what I'm saying is, qua phenomenology, they're not, we have to acknowledge as such, right? Which is not to say there's not a linguistic dimension to them, we can get back to that later, but they are not, social intercourse is not just talking, right? It's not just language. There's something fundamentally else in our experience of being with people. So while we can, and we probably will, we could quibble about what exactly counts as a distinct mode of sensing, for now the point is simply to recognize that every experience includes at least one, and usually multiple, almost all the time, multiple modes of sensing, right? There is no experiencing that is not sensing. That's the fundamental point I need to make here. Okay, so that's that one, the transcendental level. But here's the thing. These sensings do not in general show up in our experience in this general sense, right? They exist. What I mean is we don't experience language as language, right? We experience language as English or German or Cree, right? So they show up within particular historical traditions or institutions within these Stiftungen, right? Vision shows up in the style of the painter or the style of the scientist, right? Like, if you don't believe me, my wife is an artist, and she just fundamentally sees the world differently than I do. Like, we just see different things, right? I mean, we see the same things, but we see them very differently, right? Sociality shows up as this particular social norm or that particular social norm, right? And of course, each of those categorizations is also too broad. Academic English is very, very different from Appalachian English, right? Like, we just talk very differently. The way my mechanic talks to other mechanics is not a thing that makes sense to me, right? I'm told it's English, but I don't know those words, right? The painter sees the world differently than the sculptor or the dramatist or the actor. And norms for professional social interaction are very different in the boardroom than they are in the courtroom, than they are in the classroom, right? All of those are professional, but in very different ways. So here we see that empirical conditions, both histories, but also local context, whether I'm in a boardroom or a courtroom, empirical conditions have a great effect on how the transcendental operates in those conditions. And so we call this level the quasi-transcendental, or some people call it the empirical transcendental level. It's where those two things come together, right? And so if Stiftungen, if these traditions describe how the transcendental exists or how it takes on being, this is how Renaud Barre talks about it in The Being of the Phenomenon. right? Sort of this is the mode of Stiftungen, or the mode of being of transcendentals. So if that's how they work, we have not yet explained why these various transcendental levels exist. What gives rise to these transcendental modes? Where do visibility and linguisticality and sociality and tactility come from, right? Where do they come from? Answers to that question, what gives rise to these various transcendental modes, that is what in phenomenology we investigate on what Derrida is, as far as I know, the first one to call it the ultra-transcendental, right? So we might say, following Kant, and maybe the early Husserl, depending on your interpretation there, but certainly following Kant, right, we might be trying to say those transcendentals exist simply because of the nature of the subject. The subject is what makes visibility be visibility, and linguisticality be linguisticality. They're built into the nature of subjectivity, that it works this way, right? Alternatively, we might say that transcendentals are generated out of ontogenetic processes of differentiation, which we can call Flesch, if we're Merleau-Ponty, or we can call différence, if we're Derrida. But they're mostly, those two views are mostly the same thing. They're not quite, there's very subtle differences. Len Lawler has a great article about the very, very subtle differences between those. But I think Len Lawler is like the only person who can explain why those two things aren't the same. Like for the most part, they're very similar, right? We might say different transcendentals arise according to the destiny of different epochs of being, if we're Heidegger, or as different responses to the call of givenness, if we're Marion, or as different expressions of the self-unfolding of life, if we're Michel Henry, right? But all of these are different ultra-transcendental accounts of where these different modes of sensing come from, right? So either way, whatever we call them, whichever track we follow, the point is that something gives rise to the transcendental modes of experience that come to us then embedded in particular traditions or institutions. And all three of those elements, the ultra-transcendental, the transcendental, and the quasi-transcendental, are included in our experiencing, but, and here's the key, but never as the object or the content of our experiencing. Right? As you sit here and listen to me speak, your experience is simultaneously linguistic, visual, tactile, social, and so much more. You hear me speaking English in a particular sort of quasi-academic, semi-formal type. This is not the most academically Englishy I could be, but it's more academic Englishy than I would be if I was talking to my kids, right? It's a sort of a weird in between. You see me wearing sort of semi-formal professional clothes. A full suit might be a little too much for me, but sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, which is what I wear when I'm writing, wouldn't be quite enough, right? Like you're trying to find that middle road that's just an appropriate, trying to be as comfortable as I can be and still be appropriate. That's what you're seeing here as you look at me now. While standing, I'm standing largely still, right? Rather bland, I have to say, in my presentation. My theater teachers would be horrified. They would beg me to move a little bit more, right? Though my philosophy profs are sort of a little bit uncomfortable with how much I'm moving. Like there's a little bit too much presentation, too much flash, not enough substance, right? Like it's, so trying to find that balance, right? To tactility, your butts feel, technically they probably feel the content of your undergarment, but I don't want to go into that. That seems slightly inappropriate. So I'm going to say they feel the hardness of the chair that you're sitting on, right? A little bit of cushion, but not quite that much, right? Which themselves, these chairs themselves show a particular style, right? Like these chairs are from the 1970s. That's where they're from, right? Like they have a particular style. It's not those chairs, you guys can't see them, but there's good IKEA hardback plastic chairs over there, right? It's not those chairs. They're from a different era of corporate industrial architecture, right? But the point is that era is embedded into the nature of the material nature of the chairs themselves, right? You can see that and know the social era that they come from, right? And your mind wanders perhaps a little bit as I'm talking, given the social norms of philosophy conference presentations, which ask us all to accommodate a lengthy plenary lecture rather than some more artful presentation, right? If I was, most places in society would not let me just get up and talk at you for 60 minutes, right? I'm not going to do that, don't worry, 60 minutes is too long. That's not how long this is. So all of these things that you see, that you experience, right? All of them can be said ultimately to arise from, all of this stuff arises from somewhere, right? The techno-scientistic capitalism of our epoch of being, or the gift of a creator, if you're less cynical than I am about where these things come from, right? Out of the series of historical interactions between humans and their material spiritual culture. That's probably where I actually follow where these things come from. But all of that is at play and at work in your experience, even if none of that is the direct object or content of your experience of sitting and listening to me talk, right? And trying to make sense of what I'm saying. That's the point. So it's all there, but it's not really what the content of your experience is. But we have to be careful here because these things also do not arise anywhere other than in your experience. And they certainly influence or express themselves in that which is the content of your experience, right? The chair that you sit on, the clothes that I wear, the speech that I give. All of these things are expressed in those things that are a content of your experience. Yet, the social norms of philosophical conference plenaries or the tradition of 1970s business architecture are not, I think we would say, the content of your experience here this morning, right? That's not what you're experiencing. So how do we experience these various elements of transcendentality, that is, of experiencing, when they are not the content of our experience? We experience them precisely as expressed in other things. But the modes of their expression are not the same, and so to these various elements of experiencing are not all experienced the same way, right? So now let me break down how we experience these different modes, I think, and then we'll talk and then we'll have a conversation about whether I'm right about these things or not. So let's begin with the traditions, the institutions, the Stiftungen, and the quasi-transcendental level that give concrete form to various transcendental modes of Empfindnisse. Things like academic English, 1970s business architecture, the social, the plenary as a mode of social address, those kinds of, that's the level we're talking about first. And when we do that, I think we experience them, of course, we experience them through the phenomena that they give rise to, but we experience them as a horizon of expectations. Right? We experience them precisely as the fittingness or not of things that we expect. These are not, for the most part, purposeful expectations, right? You're not thoughts of, I expect this to happen when I walk in here, or I expect this to happen, but rather they're sort of a background horizon which enables us to experience anything at all. In that sense, they don't show up directly. I think Felix is going to talk a little bit more later in the conference about horizons and sort of how they show up. So this is a question maybe we can return to later in the conference in Felix's talk, right? They don't show up directly, but they remain part of our experience precisely as that which gives rise to a sense of familiarity, or a sense of disappointment, or a sense of surprise. And something feels good about this, or doesn't feel quite right, or whatever the case may be. In that sense, Stiftungen are experienced, I'm claiming here, as an affective valence that modifies and shapes our experiences. They are not, precisely speaking, I think, any one particular feeling of familiarity or disappointment or surprise, each of which could then be the content of a particular experience. Rather, they give rise to those feelings. They're sort of the background, the milieu out of which those feelings emerge. And as such, they surround our experiences. I'm not good at metaphors, so I'm going to try a couple different ones, and you can tell me if they work. They surround our experiences kind of like an electron around an atom, right? This is not simply a horizon, a background as a sort of neutral backdrop against which the actual content emerges. It's an affective valence that gives everything in the experience a particular tincture. So here's my second attempt at a metaphor. It's a valence, but it's a tincture, right? And there's a slight difference between the two things I'm trying to describe there. So let me try to describe briefly the valence from the tincture. In psychology, valence refers to a characteristic of emotions that determines their emotional effect, right? So whether a particular emotion will strike someone as attractive, broadly speaking, good, as something that I want, or repulsive, right? Bad, I want to avoid that. Similarly here, Stiftungen shape the likelihood of a particular phenomena affecting us positively. I want that. I'm attracted to that. That's a good thing. Or negatively. I want to avoid that. that disgusts me, right? Something like that. In this sense, it's a kind of background charge, predisposing us to be attracted or repulsed by something. But this charge, in turn, imparts to particular experiences a kind of tincture or a color, like a dye dropped in the water, right? It hasn't become the full color yet, but it's sort of merging into that color, right? It's trending towards being that feeling or being that color. That is, the predisposition is present in the experience as a kind of pre-coloring of the experience that gives it a kind of feel or an aura that is not yet a fully developed affective response. It's not a full feeling yet, but nevertheless leans affect in one direction rather than another. And while we probably aren't consciously aware of this leaning affect, we nevertheless feel it precisely as a kind of proto-attraction or proto-repulsion, right? And proto here precisely because it is not yet itself a fully formed attraction that we would notice or be able to articulate as such. My point is simply to say that traditions, institutions at this level of Stiftungen, they are not simply a logical, epistemological, or phenomenological background to our experience. They also have an affective force in our experiencing. And we somehow feel that affective force, even though it does not itself arise to the level of a distinct affect that could be the content of our experience. It's not itself a particular feeling. An example here, I don't know if this is a good example because it might be very controversial, but if you agree with me about the view I'm about to express in the example, I think it really helps flesh out what I'm trying to talk about, right? So we'll see. But an example here might be the way that Black bodies tend to make white people in North America feel vaguely unsafe, even if few white people would consciously feel threatened by their presence, right? Do Black people make you uncomfortable? No, of course not, right? But then when I'm in an elevator and Black people come in, I sort of curl in the corner a little bit, right? It's this sort of unsafeness is not a full-fledged feeling, but it's kind of an aura or a tincture that causes a child reaching for a candy bar to be felt as an immediate threat. Right? So that's the kind of thing that I mean, right? Like it's not a full feeling yet, but it gives rise, it just makes me, I'm having a response to this situation that when I'm outside the situation, someone's like, why did you shoot that kid? Well, I felt unsafe. Why? It's a 12-year-old with a candy bar. Like what? Right? But well, you weren't there. You don't know what. Like, and that's it. I don't doubt their feeling. I don't doubt that they felt unsafe. Right? That's the point. Okay. So that mode of presentation, that mode of experiencing, how we experience those things, the traditions, is different, it seems to me, from how Empfindnisse are experienced in our experiencing, how these sensings, right, the transcendental level. In general, those sensings are experienced as Alia Al-Sajid puts it, as, quote, a tacit bodily awareness that is lived through without self-ascription or objectification, end quote. The without objectification part, that part's similar to how we experience Stiftungen, so that part's the same. But the difference here is that Empfindnisse are experienced as a kind of tacit bodily awareness, an implicit but rarely thematized sense of an awareness of the world. This awareness, of course, has various modes corresponding to the various types of Empfindnisse, right? I am tacitly aware of the world as seeable, or as touchable, or as hearable, or as speakable, and so on. But as tacit, this awareness does not rise to the level of a discrete thought or feeling. I am not consciously thinking, and I rarely, if ever, consciously think, I can use language, right? I can see things. Like that is not a thought that I have, but rather this awareness manifests itself, I think, in the freedom with which we take up the various Empfindnisse. So let me use language as our example here. I am tacitly aware of my linguistic connection to the world. Right? This is not simply the sense that I can speak or write about the world, but the sense of the world as linguistic, as speakable, as writable, but also as speaking, as meaningful, as affecting and affected by language. I would suggest that this tacit awareness shows up in our experiencing precisely in that freedom we feel in using language. The power, the ability to make new words, or to give new meaning to old words, to refold language in creative ways, or to redeploy words or images in new ways or in new contexts. Right? We speak ironically or we speak sarcastically, and suddenly the word takes on a whole new meaning. We speak to our parents and our children or our friends at work, and in each case, we easily and probably without thinking speak slightly differently, using different language, different slang, and different tones of voice to communicate the same or similar ideas. Right? We use swear words to express our joy when we're with friends in a way that we probably don't express joy at work. Right? And we don't think about it first. We just do it. Right? We know how to do that. In all these ways, we experience our linguisticality without thematizing it as such or having a direct experience of it. Right? We would not normally say that we have an experience of the freedom of language so much as we assume that freedom in our other linguistic experiences. But nonetheless, the claim I'm making, that freedom is there in the experience, right? And we could draw attention to that in various ways. We could read a poem. Right? We could hear a song that uses words in a different way. Or a child asks us, how come we can't say that word when Nana is around? Right, yeah, don't. Good that you know that, but let's talk about why now. Right, a miscommunication happens with a coworker and we're left to figure out where things went wrong, right? Or a phenomenologist just asks us to think differently, right? All of those contribute to that. In all these cases and more, we're prompted to look differently at our linguistic experience. And in doing so, we come to realize something that has always been there through the entirety of our experience and our use of language. So too would be the case, I'm claiming, for all the transcendental conditions of experience vis-a-vis the empirical experiences that pertain to them. But this is not simply the case of drawing our attention to that which is already part of our perceptual field, but which we aren't paying attention to. It's not like when someone says, hey, the lights are buzzing. And you're like, oh, you're right, they are. And I've kind of always heard them, but I just sort of blocked it out, right? But like now that I say that, I can listen to them and I can hear them again, right? It's not like that, right? The shift is not about where we direct the ray of our conscious attention. It's a difference between our experience of particular words and our experiencing of the freedom of using language is the difference of how these things give themselves to us in our intuition. Right? It's not just what we pay attention to, it's how we pay attention to it that's different. All right. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So we're left then to talk about the ultra-transcendental. We've done 2 of the 3, that's the 3rd one left, and then we're done. This one, the one that's most removed from our empirical experience, is perhaps the hardest, I think, to notice in our experiencing, right? It is. However, it's crucial that we come to recognize it, lest this be seen simply as logical precursors to phenomenological inquiry, right? This is not, I think, simply a case of, well, transcendentals have to come from somewhere, so let's speculate where they come from. Sometimes it feels that way. When Derrida's talking about différance, it sort of doesn't really feel like we're doing phenomenology anymore, right? Like it feels different, but I don't think it is. I think to be genuinely phenomenological, ultra-transcendentals have to be part of our experiencing and not just those logical necessities for it. And I think we do experience the ultra-transcendental in ways somewhat similar to the transcendentals. So where there we talked about our experience of the freedom of language as part of our linguistic experiencing, here I would prefer to talk in terms of confidence or vulnerability. Right? So Kant and the early Husserl, both of whom posit the subject as the ultra-transcendental, show us an account of experience that is immensely confident in humanity's ability to transcend and control the vagaries of empirical circumstances. Right? Like they are really confident in what humans can do. And this Enlightenment view of human mastery falls out of favor sometime after the Second World War, perhaps already between the wars. Right? By the time Merleau-Ponty and Derrida are positing differentiation rather than subjectivity as the ultra-transcendental principle, they also exhibit a much more suspicious attitude towards human sovereignty and towards human capability. right? My contention here is that this is not simply a logical or philosophical connection, but a phenomenological one. That the nature of experiencing changed as a result of differing conceptions of the ultra-transcendental. Now, small methodological point here, qua conceptions, this can still be attributed to traditions, to Stiftungen, rather than to the ultra-transcendental itself. As soon as we try to articulate that ultra-transcendental, we're doing so from within some particular tradition or other, and so we've already gone back down to the quasi-transcendental level, right? So while the difference is illustrated, I use this as an example to illustrate my point, right? My contention is that there has always been a vulnerable character to experiencing. All the way back to Kant and his invocation of intuition. That is, experiencing is always at least tacitly aware that the subject is not fully in control of experience. This awareness of our vulnerability, of our lack of sovereignty and control, shows up, again, not in a direct feeling or an idea, but rather in our need to engage the world, our need to be connected to the world. Hence, the freedom of language, for example, is only part of our experiencing. There is also an experiencing of a constitutive communality, right? That I'm part of a community with other subjects and with the world. That Steinbach, following Husserl, discusses under the rubric of the home world. And Mike was talking about that earlier, the Heimwelt. The particularities of my home world are sort of quasi-transcendental. They give me the valence and the tincture of affective responses characteristic of our experiencing of the quasi-transcendental. But the ultra-transcendental component of being generated within some home world or other is experienced, I think, implicitly in the sense of worldedness in general that manifests itself in moods, in the broadly Heideggerian sense of anxiety, which is when I'm uneasy with my vulnerability, or care, when I embrace my vulnerability and my interdependence. These moods, which clearly must be phenomenologically distinguished from particular affective responses, right? So it's not just my feeling of anxiety. I'm also anxious, all the time, but that's different from this mood of anxiety, right? I can take medicine for the first one, not for the second. These moods give kind of, well, mood, right? Like they give a sort of affective valence, or it's a little bit more than what I was earlier calling this affective valence, but less than a distinct feeling or a distinct affect to the entirety of our experiencing. Okay. All right. So, quick conclusion, then I'm done. So undoubtedly, much more work needs to be done to phenomenologically clarify how we experience these differing elements of experience. Like I just painted a briefest of sketches here for you, right? Especially the ultra-transcendental component needs a lot more nuance and clarity in distinguishing types of affective responses. But since this is an exploratory workshop, I'm hoping what I've offered is enough to begin to workshop some explorations of how we experience our experiencing. So let's think a little bit more about that together now. Thank you.
Thank you, Neal. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Neal will
I'll take. Yeah, Jeremy.
Okay, I guess I have a question about the whole talk. We're talking about objects and non-objects.
Yeah.
And sometimes something that, one example in which an object can emerge is I'm trying to remember a name. So it's not objectively before me, but then I remember it and there's an object. What have you just been doing for the last 30 minutes? You're talking about lived through experience and reflecting upon it. Now, have you turned it into an object? Or do we have another alternative way to look at it, do we actually have objective access to the lived as such?
No, this is a great question, right? And I think Martin was getting at that in his talk, right? The dangers of language is that we do, given the nature of at least the English language, the German, most of the European languages work this way, right? Like in that the structure of sentences is like a subject and a verb with objects, right? There has to be an object in most verbs. Given the structure of our language, we risk objectifying things which are not themselves objects, right? And so that's my claim here, my contention here is these transcendental modes of operation are not objects. They are not things in that sense, right? They don't, to use the words you used from Heidegger, right? They don't stand in themselves. They only make sense in the milieu, in the in-between, in the engaging of things. And as such, they are not themselves things.
Oh, and I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think everything you said totally made sense, is really getting at what is going on is essential.
Yeah.
But how is it possible to talk about it?
Yeah,
How is it
that's-
possible to think about it? How do you
yeah.
portray it? And I think we're not.
Yeah.
I think it's lived experience is,
Yeah.
and a dimension of that which is,
Yeah.
even though it's primarily lived through.
Yeah.
I think the primary lived through itself can be accessed objectively as lived.
Mhm.
And if it can't, I don't see how anything you said even makes sense or is even possible.
Yeah.
I don't, so, but that's, I don't know, I just wanted to.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think so much would come down to what we mean by objective or access it objectively here, right? Like I'm trying to keep the word object for things in themselves, things that are what they are independent of their relationship to other things, right? That's what I mean by objects, right? And in that sense, I think these transcendental modes are never that. Even in our primary experiencing, they're never that, right? But the difficulty then comes, of course, exactly as you said, and how then do we talk about it? And this is why in my talk, I spend a lot of time saying, it's kind of like this, but not really. Or like I'm trying to like evoke in you something, because I think your underlying intuition seems correct to me, right? And it's sort of at the foundation of phenomenology, right? What makes a phenomenological analysis compelling? Not its logical certainty, but rather that when someone hears it, they go, I think I know what you're talking about. Like, yeah, that resonates with me. I get that, right? So there is some sense in which we can create descriptions that either resonate with people or don't, right? And in that sense, if they resonate with me or they don't, either way, I have, as you said, I have some access to these things that I'm talking about, right? That makes me able to say, yeah, that fits, or no, that doesn't really fit, right? So there is some way we have access to these things. But I think it's I think it's a crucial actually insight to say, but that normal mode of access we have to them is not an objectifying one, right? Dan Zahavi talks a lot about this in the what is it, self-reflection, self-awareness and alterity book, right? About the way in which, in talking about these things, phenomenologists, we have turned them into objects, and then we treat them as if they're objects, and then we actually have missed the point of how they actually normally function in our experience, right? Unless we're very careful to avoid doing that. Even then, yeah, Ian in the back and then Mike.
So we talked about with the distinct modes of generating senses, how that is experienced as a tacit bodily awareness, which then manifests as a freedom in which we use the senses. I was just wondering if there's anything to that same structure applying to things that.
So I'm gonna take a shower and I'll go get Jenny.
Sensual, for instance, an activity such as how we dress. Because like I am gender nonconforming and therefore I experience.
Okay, let me help you get a snack.
I attempt to experience more freedom within that activity than many
You're like
do.
sick. I
But
think it's
that freedom
better
is
if you
also
stay
being
here.
pushed back against. And so I wonder if that can be expanded beyond the sensual.
I
Yeah,
don't want to make
I
you
mean,
more sick.
okay, depending on what you mean by the sensual, right? Like, so I do think it applies, like, so I was
No,
using
I'm
the
not
example of
leaving her
language,
alone.
right? Which is not traditionally sensual in what most people mean by sensual, but is in
I'll
the
think
way
about
I'm
it.
using sensings here, right? So I think that's right. I think your example is a great one, because it's an interesting question where sexuality lies. And is sexuality or sexual, well, yeah. And again, here one has to be even extra careful, but I'll keep sexuality as the broad category for now. Is sexuality itself a distinct mode of engaging the world? Does it open the world to us in new ways? It might. There are some people that would argue that it does. There are other people I think who would argue, no, it's something else. It's a facet of our identity perhaps, or something different. So I'll say I don't know about that, but if it is a mode of sensing, then everything you said would follow and makes a lot of sense, right? Then part of that mode of sensing is we experience freedoms in how we express that mode of sensing in the world. But of course, and here is where I would say the mode of sensing of sexuality comes against, let's say, the mode of sociality, right? But then what we happen is social norms come on us and say, ooh, I feel like I need to do this, but something won't let me, right? Something else is impinging, and we feel a tension between these two distinct modes of sensing in our lives, right? And this is what creates so much inner anguish, right? For some people who are trans or just more broadly gender non-conforming, right? Is they feel both of these things, and they feel both of them within themselves, right? Often it's not like they feel like I want to do this, but other people won't let me. They feel themselves internally the tension of wanting to express this, but feeling they shouldn't somehow. And so the first step for a lot of them in their own process is first they have to come to terms with their own inner, sort of the way they've internalized some of these social norms and pressures, and then they can start to sort of shift other people's opinions, right? So I think there's ways, and if we were to develop this, Merleau-Ponty gestures in this direction and does a few things, but not enough. But there's good starts there, right? We have to talk about the way that these different sensings relate to each other, right? Visibility and orality are not, they are irreducible. One can never get you to the other, but they also, of course, are deeply intertwined. Most of our experiences, right? And Martin, you were talking about this, right? When you change it so that we don't see as well, we hear differently, right? So there is, of course, an intertwinement between the different modes of sensings as well that is constitutive of the warp and woof of our experiencing, and more work needs to be done, I think, phenomenologically, to sort of talk about the relation between those different modes of sensing and how they relate to each other and how they don't. Yeah, Mike.
So just a question on the first level, the Stiftungen
Yeah.
level, that example, like for instance, of racial kind of things. It sounds like you're talking about them as sort of preconditions, as it were, of the emergence of an intentionality, or are they already sort of intentional? Like, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, when do those things? Schutz talks about typification, but it's built into our stock of knowledge.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about where the intentionality comes in.
Yeah, I don't want to say they're preconditions because I don't think they come first, right? But I think they shape our intentions, right? Our intention, that's what I mean by calling them quasi-transcendental. I mean to say they are functioning transcendental, right? They are shaping our experience, right? But they are shaping it in ways that in this case are not universalizable to everyone, but are certainly not just subjective, and that it's not just me who has this experience, right? Like there's a tradition in which those in this tradition, those subjects who have been shaped in this tradition would all or largely have this experience as well, right? In terms of intentionality, right? And again, it depends on what we mean by intentionality here, right? Because intentionality has connotations of purposiveness that are not present in phenomenological accounts of intentionality, right? For phenomenological intentionality, which I just take to be sort of engagement with the world, for me, the transcendentals are intentionality, right? And in fact, intentionality is almost in a way functions ultra transcendentally, I think, in phenomenology, right? There's some sort of the way that visibility works suggests that we have to be engaging with the world, right? So even my later account of vulnerability is that, right? Like we have to be always already engaged with the world for any of the rest of this to make sense. And if we aren't, then you got all kinds of, well, how do you know that what you see is really the world? Like, then you've got all these problems that get opened up in sort of empiricist metaphysics or empiricist epistemology that phenomenology is hoping to just avoid by sort of bypassing that problem, right? So yeah, Simon, and I don't know how much time I have left.
About another 5 minutes.
Okay.
4 or 5 minutes.
Perfect.
I'll try to- I'll try to-
Just want to say I really enjoyed it. It was really great.
Thanks.
And I think so. Previously, forget what's your name, sir? Jeremy. I really appreciated your question, and one of the things you asked was, can we experience this stuff? That's what I heard you say, sort of, right? In essence, you know, and essentially, like, no, it's not an object in the world. You know, you don't, you know, and so, I would like to ask, you know, is this similar to how I don't actually have any experience of space or weight but I have transcendental objectivity has space, right? So there's no such thing. I can't point at a piece of space. I have to point at an object which possesses space as a condition for being an object. So is that sort of like, is it fair to say that what you're talking about is transcendental subjectivity? I mean, is it basically like you cannot be a subject without this valence, the electrons, you know?
Yeah, I'm definitely.
Is that language?
Yeah,
Is it okay?
what I'm pointing out is definitely, these are transcendentality.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about, how we experience transcendental modes, right? And I'm just pointing out there's different, even in phenomenology, there's different modes of talking about transcendentality, right? So there's a couple of different levels of transcendentality. And I think we experience those different levels differently, but we do experience them, right? The point I'm trying to make is we experience them exactly as you're saying. We're not just speculating about them, right? This is not just sort of speculative philosophy. It can be, but that's not what this is actually is talking about experiencing. But then, as you said, how do we experience them, right? We don't experience them as objects.
Yep.
So we don't experience them that way. So we have to talk about different ways of how do we experience our own experiencing is really the question that I'm asking.
So then that's what I thought. And so then the curiosity I have, and I'm really interested in this, is there such a thing as an object which is experienced inside of transcendental subjectivity? You know, so obviously I don't mean to say like you know, coats on hooks and all these kind of benign philosophical things that made me want to shoot myself in freshman year of college, but like you know, something about like God, you know, is God not just the foundation or love or intersubjectivity or sexuality of actual intercourse, right? Like this is not just the foundation of life. It's not the transcendental subjectivity in the sense of it's the requirement to be a living subject, but it's actually there's something like a non-object inside of this milieu. Is that fair?
I think if those are, I'll leave it conditional. If those things are experienceable, I think it's plausible to say we experience them not as objects, but as transcendental modes, right? This fundamentally, I know your paper is going to be about this. I won't stay thunder. This I think is exactly what Henri is doing with God, right? He's saying our primary experience with God is not as a thing that I think about or can have experiences of out there. Our primary experience of God is just in our own life, right? Is living itself. Living itself is already God. But then we have to rethink what we mean by God and the implications of that, right? But so yes, I think that is one direction to take this, that I think is consistent with this project that I'm laying out for sure. Do we have time for one more? One more? Michael.
Thank you. It was a great talk. I have some difficulties with the notion of ultra transcendental.
Yes.
Since I think speaking about it, you go outside of phenomenology, since ultra transcendental has no phenomenality. And I mean, it doesn't have phenomenality of phenomena, nor the phenomenality which we connect to phenomenology of phenomenology.
Yeah, right.
Phenomenology, for me, it's a two-step movement. Like you have sensations and sensings.
Yeah.
You have, you know.
Yeah.
With this step to ultra,
it's too much, right? Yes. I hear that, and this is why I said like for me, this is why I wanted to try in this paper to say, do we actually have experiences of the ultra transcendental, right? And I still want to say I think we do, but it's the hardest to talk about because it's the most abstract. It's the farthest from the empirical, right? I think if the conclusion ends up being, no, we don't really have experiences of these. This is just speculation. I think all that means is that phenomenology requires a certain metaphysics or a metaphenomenology, which is not damning to me. I'm fine with, like, sure, I'm okay with that. So I don't think at least for now, I want to say I think we can also talk about how we experience them. Like I think they do have a phenomenality, but I think their phenomenality is, as you said, not as a phenomenon, but as phenomenality, right? Is experiencing is another way I translate phenomenality, right? Like, so I think it's just, we experience them as an experiencing of the world, right? And that's why I was trying to cast it here as a kind of vulnerability, an openness onto the world that is an essential facet, I think, of our experiencing, right? And one that when we try to cover it over, when we try to act as if we don't need the world, we actually feel that loss, right? Like we have loneliness, we have higher rates of anxiety, I think our bodies feel that for us because we feel the tension that this is not actually fit with my experiencing of the world, right? But I'm also willing to say, as I articulate that, and this will be the last thing because I know we're done, that like I might be slipping between levels in saying that, right? Like I might be sliding back down into ultra transcendental and into feelings in ways that don't fit with the ultra transcendental. So that's all to say. I think this is a really important point that you raised, like, and it needs more work. Yeah, thank you.